If you're anything like any American ever, you've probably heard the idea that we won the Cold War because we had the free market and the rest of the world did not. Many people use this as a way to justify free market principles, saying that all other systems have been tried and failed. In fact, this led such prominent researchers as Francis Fukuyama to proclaim in his End of History that all other possibilities, aside from liberal Western democracies with a free market economy, were unviable. Now this is troubling, not just because all other possibilities in fact have not been tried, but because it represents a deep misunderstanding of what made us win the Cold War. See, we had a lot of things going for us, like superior resource bases, a larger population, and more allies. But beyond that, we in fact had a more socialized system. Understanding what that system was and why free market principles on their own did not create America as we know it today is key to understanding why free market principles on their own are not a viable economic system. We're going to go back in time a little bit here, back to the 1930s during the Great Depression. This depression is often blamed on the thought that rampant speculation on the stock market caused a stock crash. It's said that on Black Tuesday, when the stock market crashed, the economy went with it. But that's not the whole picture. Much led up to that, and there was a lot that needed to be in place for the entire economy to go down when the stocks did. For example, you had an incredibly high rate of wealth inequity. Such a high one, in fact, that we had not seen such rates again until just before the current depression. This meant record numbers of Americans living in poverty before the crash ever occurred. Not only that, but after the crash, there was less of a resilient base to prop back up the economy when things went sour. As America's economy had grown more centralized after the Industrial Revolution, there were less small businesses, small farms, and small institutions that could prop up the economy when the big ship failed. See, it's not big companies, but often these small players that actually come up with the innovation that drives our societies forward. If you kill those small players, you tend to have a lot of stagnation, a lot less growth, and a lot less diversity in the new ideas coming forward into our world. It's kind of like a Titanic issue. If you don't have the lifeboats, when the big ship goes down, everyone goes down with it. This lack of diversity and means for creation of wealth meant that the economy as a whole was at the mercy of only the largest institutions. How we fix that problem ties in directly to how we won the Cold War. And it doesn't have to do with rampant free markets. It has to do with taxation, regulation, and redistribution. See, from about the middle part of the Great Depression, all the way up until 1973, we were governed by the idea of Keynesian economics. This is derived from the thought of John Maynard Keynes, an influential economist who lived from the 1880s to the 1940s. Now there are two principles to Keynesian thought. The first is that during times of recession, the government should spend money to re-bolster the economy and spur on the private sector. The second, less discussed one is perhaps more important though, and that is the idea that there needs to be a permanent structure for the redistribution of wealth inside of a society. Now, most people don't think of the 1950s and 60s in America as being a socialist time period. I mean, there was the Red Scare and McCarthyism, and we were all convinced we were about to be blown up by the freaking Russians. But, in fact, this is the most socialized time period of US history. During the 1950s, we saw the highest income tax, highest capital gains tax, and most growth our country has ever known. If you think of anything in the Great Americana, from Route 66 to Jackson Pollock, it was likely funded by public investment and public sector spending. It wasn't that the private sector didn't play a part, they most certainly did, but if anything, a lucrative tax base enabled public expenditure that also enabled the private sector to grow. This is because public spending on things like roads, schools, and the telecom industry enabled many small fish to get in on the game of private industry, diversifying our market and making a more vibrant and expansive system. That diversity shelters us from big market shocks, preventing things like the Great Depression. You could think of public expenditure and redistribution as being the metaphoric snowmelt in a water cycle. If you take it out, for a short while, things look okay. Rain continues to fall, there's still rivers a little bit, yada yada yada. But after a while you start to notice something. More and more snow is packing up at the top, and less is getting down to the source. That being the ocean and other avenues for water to get up into the atmosphere and eventually become snow. Inevitably, this creates an unstable system where all resources are piled up on top, and they have no way of getting back down into the things that feed their actual growth. In the short term, there's a lot of places to go around to get water from, but after a while, inevitably, all of those places will dry out, and all that will be left is a non-growing, non-expansive system. Wealth works this way, and it causes a few problems. The first is that without any means of redistribution, those at the bottom are pretty much trapped where they are. They have dwindling resources and fewer ways to make means for themselves inside of the new world. The second is that because capitalism and free markets are predicated on an idea of eternal growth, even those at the top find themselves in an undesirable and non-growing situation. And the third, though less of a systematic issue, is more of a moral one. Is it right that some should have more wealth and opportunity than others, simply because of the circumstance of their location or their birth? Like, is it fair that the snowpacks get all the water just because they broke the system? See, ironically, the redistributive models that we enacted after the Great Depression resemble more of a socialized system, and yet somehow they enabled better free enterprise. And for further irony, we might actually see the USSR system not as a communist one, but as a neo-feudal one, wherein people of power controlled the economy for their own ends and aggregated massive amounts of wealth to the top. In effect, this made their system look less diverse and more top-heavy. So is it much of a surprise that in the 1990s they collapsed under the weight of this? There's a lot to be asked about this in the modern times. As big companies become bigger, it becomes harder for small, diverse competitors to get in on the game. And the fewer people there are in a marketplace, the more that our economy actually resembles the command economy of the USSR. See, it comes back down to that issue of certain non-free elements of the market, making the market actually more free, more diverse, and more capable in the end. With the increasing privatization of everything from education to healthcare, we have to ask questions as to whether or not the big fish eating the small fish is really the best approach that we have, and whether or not we should reverse some of the principles that we saw instituted under Reagan. Because many crashes and an incredible decrease of diversity later, we have to ask ourselves the question of whether or not we are actually losing the principles that made us strong during the most trying time of our country's history. And perhaps in answering that question, we will find that it is not an unregulated free market, but one which is regulated in such a way that allows the lowest order of society to reach the highest echelon, which in fact, in the end, is most beneficial to us all. Riley here. Next week we'll be talking about technology and capitalism, and what both mean in an age of artificial intelligence. So, until then, peace until next week.